Stand up, take my people with me. Together we are going to a brand new home. While we cross the river, can you hear freedom calling, calling me to answer?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for your patience. For those of you who walked over from the breakfast morning prayer, you know we ran over a little bit of time, so we appreciate those who came to join us today. You're right on time. So happy Juneteenth. I'm thrilled to welcome you to our morning breakout session entitled Mind the Gap, Addressing Systematic Racism Across the Educational Continuum. My name is Gloria V. Fonseca Bolorin. Let me backtrack. My name is Dr. Gloria V. Fonseca Bolorin. I am a U of M staff member, and I'm also a recent PhD graduate from U of M's Marshall Family School of Education. Thank you. I'm honored to be moderating this panel for lots of different reasons, but in particularly because our goal today here is to acknowledge and unpack the complex and complicated history of racism in the United States educational system. It is a history that includes movement and gain for minority groups and those systematically excluded, but also includes steps backwards and resistance towards progress. I am a product of both of these truths. Education has afforded me every single opportunity that I have gotten. I gained entry into higher education through federally funded and state-funded pre-collegiate programs, and I flourished with support programs and interventions in higher education. But at the same time, I entered my four-year institution in California at the same year Proposition 209 passed, ending affirmative action. It was a tumultuous time on campus, and I experienced lots of stigmatization and hate and anger. And then again in graduate school, here in the University of Michigan, I became a student right when Prop 2 passed, ending affirmative action and other targeted forms of support. Education holds both positive and really stigmatizing experiences for me. And today we hope to dive into and acknowledge those individuals here who are students, who are practitioners, who are researchers, who are also in this complicated and complex situation and spaces. We are fortunate today to have a panel that has diverse educational professional experiences and ideas for impactful solutions to close the educational gaps we've seen and to move towards ending racism in education. Despite the different educational spaces our panelists work within, they share a common goal of advocating for others, pushing boundaries, and leading difficult conversations in order to transform educational environments. Let me first introduce Professor Alicia Jackson. Professor Jackson is a member of the law faculty at Cincinnati University College of Law and serves as the Director of Academic Success and Bar Preparation Services. She's a scholar, educator in criminal law, family law, juvenile law, multi-state law, and survey of Florida law. We are thrilled to have Professor Jackson's legal expertise and to learn more about how federal state policies inform our educational practices and policies. Our second panelist is Catherine McLemore. She is an associate professor of public policy here at the University of Michigan's Gerald Ford School of Public Policy. Professor McLemore is a leading scholar and educator on social safety net, educational policy, labor economics, and economic demography. We are delighted for her to share her experiences with the National Bureau of Economic Research and how educational programs can improve the educational outcomes for children. Our final panelist is Michael Rouse. Michael is an experienced educator who has taught a combination of math courses for over a decade at Thornridge High School, located in South Suburb Chicago. As a teacher and professional development leader, Michael will share with us his recent work with the Institute for Racial Justice at Loyola University of Chicago, and more about how schools are funded unequally, especially within schools that serve students of color. Thank you, you beat me to the punch for the applause. The first portion of this panel will include introductory questions, and then we will end with Q&A focused portion of the panel. However, audience questions are welcome throughout the conversation. There are gonna be index cards where you can see Doreen is raising her hand in the back for you to write your questions on. And she has her hand raised again. If you wanna hand those questions, you can give those to them at the end of the row of those chairs. So without further ado, let's begin with some questions. And I'm gonna turn this off and go sit with our panelists. So, Alicia, let's begin with you. Share a little bit about how you came to be working in education and addressing institutional racism in education.
Good morning, and first I want to thank the University of Michigan and this amazing committee for putting together such a phenomenal program centered around important conversations that impact us all. So kudos to the University of Michigan and every student, staff, and faculty member at the institution. So my name is Alicia. I am a law professor at Stetson University. What brings me to this conversation and the work that I do is really my life story. I am the story of structural racism in education. I grew up hearing stories of my father who walked miles to school, right? And I'm like, yeah, sure, Dad, everybody walked miles to school, right? But it was at that moment that he said, you know, he spent his days picking cotton, working in fields, not very long ago in Southeast Georgia, when he talked about the only days he went to school is when it rained because they couldn't work in the fields. And when he went to school, he was so far behind that he didn't know where he was or what was happening. That is structural racism, that he grew up on the farms in which his family sharecropped. That touched me in a special place. That is my life story. The second experience that helped to shape why I do what I do was I married a teacher. When we met in college at this tender age, he said, so what do you want to be when you grow up? I said, I'm going to law school. I want to be a lawyer. I want to save the world. And I said, but I see you're a pre-med major. What do you want to do? And he said, I want to teach biology because I too want to change the world through children. That touched me in a special way. Growing up in the state of Florida, and I am a proud Floridian while you all are saying your prayers for me, that also helped to shape why I do what I do and why I write and teach in the area of educational equality, gender, racism, and particular structural racism. That's why I do what I do.
Hi, I'm Kathy Mitchell-Moore. I'm an associate professor here at Michigan. So I think my life story also really shaped where I am today as well. I grew up in the south suburbs of Chicago, coincidentally, actually, the town over from where Michael lives and serves on the school board. I went to the same high school that his kids went to. I went to Homewood Flossmoor Public High School. And I didn't realize it at the time because, you know, in your childhood, you don't think about these things. But I was really so lucky to have grown up in such a diverse community. I went to school every day with kids who didn't look like me, who had really different family backgrounds, but we were all sharing the same lived experiences. Well, not the same, but, you know, we all were kind of interacting together and having that shared experience. And so I think that really shaped me. And I didn't realize how unique that was until I left and I went to college at a small, predominantly white institution. And it was a little bit of a culture shock, to be honest, to be in a really different type of environment. So that's shaped my research a lot. So I'll briefly talk about some recent work I'm doing, and I know we'll talk about it more later. But for instance, I do a lot of work on income gaps in education outcomes, and that necessarily intersects with systemic racism. So one project I was working on, and this sounds, I'm a policy person, I get into the policy, the wonky details, so please bear with me. But, I was really interested in understanding how we measure income when we're trying to assess income gaps. And this actually matters a lot for how we measure racial achievement gaps. So in the last 20 years or so, we've really shifted to relying on administrative data sources to measure achievement gaps. They're really rich data sources that have great information about student outcomes. And we typically will do things like, try to estimate a black-white test score gap, and then we'll try to understand where it comes from. So is it based, how much comes from differences in schooling context or neighborhood context or family background? But we often don't have great measures of those things. So for instance, for family background, we often only know things like, did the student receive subsidized meals in a given year? So that's a marker for low income. But at least in the state of Michigan, Black students who receive subsidized meals are really different from white students who receive subsidized meals. A Black student and a white student, both looking like they are on subsidized meals, the Black student is much more likely to be chronically poor compared to the white student. So when we're trying to control for family background, we're not doing a good job of that because we're not taking into account the differences that underlie those categories. So I've done some work recently that shows that once you try to account for more of a full, rich accounting of their historical interaction with the system, you actually see things like the black-white gap in college going reverses. Black students are more likely to go to college than white students. And so I know we'll get into the details of how this matters, but it matters not only just for how we measure these gaps, but it also matters for policy because the way we fund schools is based on these same measures that are measured imperfectly. So all of this has really inspired me to kind of keep going and trying to unpack and pull back the layers and understand how these seemingly colorblind policies really have disparate impacts and perpetuate inequities in the education system.
Okay, I too would like to say thank you to the University of Michigan and its staff to put together today's program. It is indeed an honor and pleasure to be here and have the opportunity to share with you some insight into my work, but ultimately to share insight into all of our work. I am a career changer. Prior to education, I was working in the financial services industry doing retirement planning for small and mid-sized businesses. I became somewhat disenfranchised with that, and my passion for it wasn't enough to overcome that disenfranchisement. So I decided to seek an opportunity elsewhere. At the encouragement of my wife, okay, let's be honest, the insistence of my wife, I decided to pursue an opportunity teaching mathematics in a high school. I have long been a person who loves math, and I jumped at that opportunity after that insistence. So coming in, I firmly believe that it was based on content knowledge. Being a successful, impactful teacher was heavily dependent on your knowledge of your content, your level of expertise in your content. That's where my education began. I quickly learned that although content knowledge is extremely important, there is so much more to teaching and being able to be impactful in teaching. And that kind of set me on the path that I'm currently on. My goal in terms of teaching has always been real simple. I want to be a transformative teacher. I'm a person with a skill set that people oftentimes don't think of students of color when they think of teaching mathematics at a high level. And that was something I loved, and I felt naturally that something I would be very effective at. So in my goal to be a transformative teacher, it caused me to think of a quote by James Baldwin. And that quote says, "The price one pays for pursuing any profession or calling is an intimate knowledge of its ugly side." Well, in my pursuit to be a transformative teacher, I came across the ugly side very quickly and very frequently. And that ugly side is the systemic racism that exists in K-12 education, especially in those STEM-related fields, which is my area of specialty. So with that in mind, not only was I introduced, but then it became a passion of mine to address those issues and to address them in a way that was meaningful for my students and those who want to pursue opportunities in STEM-related fields. So as my goal has not changed, my goal will not change. I am passionate about being in the classroom. I have rejected opportunities to move into administration because my passion is definitely in the classroom. So I will continue that work in the classroom. But because I've had experiences that's given me an opportunity to have a bigger voice in terms of moving policy and decisions forward in education, I became a part of my local school board. So I teach in one district and I function in the school board in a different district. The districts are comparable in some ways and very different in others, but a common thread is that they both face significant challenges related to institutional racism. And that's how I got on the path of the work I'm currently doing.
Thank you, everyone. I'd like to direct this next question to Michael to continue your conversation about the current issues, including community, institutional, state, or federal, and national, that you face as a teacher leader that are manifestations of institutional racism in education.
One thing that I've learned in my work in terms of education is that oftentimes initiatives look very different at different levels of education. The initiative can be very the same. How that initiative might look to a superintendent is oftentimes very different from the way it looks to a building level administrator, our teacher, our paraprofessional, someone who supports a teacher. The issues that education face are very much the same. The issues are very similar, but it's just different at every level. When we talk about educational funding, which is a tremendous issue, area that has captured my attention in my work with the Institute for Racial Justice at Loyola of Chicago. And one thing that has come to my attention is that the way we fund schools in the state of Illinois is through the use of property taxes. We have known for decades that that was an ineffective way to adequately and with some sense of equality fund schools. But yet that model still persists. In Illinois, we have what's called an evidence-based funding model. And in that model, the state establishes a target funding level for each of the districts in the state. And that's part of their equity efforts. And so what that means is that schools that typically are underfunded will just receive additional funding from the state to help offset that discrepancy and therefore create equity. Well, along with that funding model came something known as adequacy. And adequacy is the actual percentage that your school receives relative to the target established by the state. In the districts in which I work, that adequacy number is somewhere in the neighborhood of 70%, give or take a few percentage points. But in addition to that, we look at our overall funding, and now we're saying, hey, the state is acknowledging that we're falling anywhere from $10 to $15 million short in terms of the appropriate level of funding for our schools. The impact of that is unbelievable. And one thing that I will talk about a little bit more later, I don't want to spend too much time at this point, but one thing is that the impact of racism in our schools is deeply buried. And oftentimes, to get to the roots of it, you have to really dig in. So if you're kind of engaging with public education on a surface level, as in my kid goes to school, they get good grades, you might not be aware of a lot of issues that your schools are dealing with that's having a very detrimental impact on student performance. So again, the issues that are common in education related to racism, same across the different levels, but it just plays out differently at the different levels.
Michael. I'd like to invite the other panelists if they'd like to add anything else.
As a thought about going deeper into the levels of racism within the school system, I think it's also important to not just focus on your own child's experience, but the experience of all children collectively. One of the things that I certainly discovered doing some research on school discipline, because many states sadly are out of compliance with the Civil Rights Act. impact in terms of how it disciplines its students of color. I think it is incredibly important that we pay attention to those types of incidents where students are suspended 3.8 times more, Black students, than non-Black students for the same offense. To be clear, the same offense. Knowing those numbers means something because states regulate education. If I were to poll in this room and ask you, do we have a constitutional right to an education? Most people believe we do when we don't. If I were to poll this room and ask you who regulates education, most people believe it is the federal government because of the Department of Education, but it is not. It is the state that regulates education because of the 10th Amendment. So paying attention to those micro things versus just the macro. What are our graduation rates? Well, if the graduation rates are subpar, why? And who is not graduating? When you look at it from a granular level, you start to see structural racism manifest itself beyond just literacy rates, but also as it relates to discipline and other ways that we engage with children in our school system, both private and public schools.
Thank you. For the next question, I'd like to first direct this to Professor McLemore. What are the educational resources and funding issues that contribute to educational inequity?
I don't think I have time to go into all of the issues, but I'm just going to highlight, I'll highlight two, one at the K-12 level and one at the higher ed level. So as Michael already mentioned, I think at the K-12 level, the biggest thing that stands out to me is how we fund schooling based on property taxes. So property taxes are assessed based on housing values. So schools that are in predominantly Black neighborhoods, we know that those houses are undervalued relative to similar houses in white neighborhoods. So inherently, that's going to mean that schools that are located in Black neighborhoods are going to raise less revenue for the same tax rate. Even if we were to do things like raise the tax rates in those neighborhoods that to raise more funding, that puts more burden on individual homeowners, and you're still not going to raise revenue to the same extent that you can in wealthier neighborhoods. So I think that's one big issue. Related to the thing I mentioned earlier with how we measure income, for instance, another way, school funding formulas, and I won't go into the details here, but schools get additional funding based on the composition of their students' needs. So the number of low-income students in the school, whether the number of students who have disabilities, there's extra funding that they receive. If those measures, if the underlying measures we use to create that funding are flawed, if they have disparate impacts on students by race, that's inherently going to create disparities in how schools receive funding. So those are a couple issues that I'm happy to elaborate on. But one thing I wanted to say at the higher ed level, just to bring that into the conversation, Dorothy Brown is a law scholar at Georgetown who wrote this really great book. My other passion is tax policy. So she wrote this really great book on systemic racism and tax policy called The Whiteness of Wealth. And she highlights a couple issues in higher ed that I think are really interesting. One is that, the one I'll highlight is when you file your taxes, you can deduct student loan interest. So if you have student loan debt, you're paying back those loans every year, you're paying interest on that debt. You can, just like the mortgage interest deduction, you can deduct that interest that you're paying from your income, which lowers your tax liability. So bear with me on the tax lesson here briefly. The issue is that there's a cap on how much interest you can deduct every year. And so, colorblind policy, nothing seems to be wrong with that, but Black borrowers have higher student loan debt balances compared to white borrowers, and so that means that Black borrowers are going to be more likely to hit that income cap, which means that they're going to be able to deduct less student loan interest relative to their student loan balances compared to white students, and white students are much more likely to have their higher ed financed by family wealth. So those are just a couple of issues that I will highlight here, but of course happy to elaborate on those as folks want to talk about them.
I'd like to see if anybody else on the panel would like to add anything else. No? Okay. Let's move on to the next question that I'd like to direct towards Professor Jackson. First, to begin with, what is your experience of the impact of educational policies and laws on educational decision-making, practices, and culture?
I absolutely love this question. Being a law scholar, but at the heart of the work that I do, being a teacher, I think I have one of the most important jobs in the world to be able to teach. So please bear with me as I turn this into a mini lecture on law and policy as it relates to education. But the one thing that my students have taught me, that the world will not and cannot change unless we understand how it works. When I walk into the room and I teach the facts, my students are moved by those facts and they effectuate change. So bear with me for a moment. So revisiting the thought of a constitutional right to an education that does not exist. People believe that it does, but it does not. Brown versus Board of Education was decided in 1954. That was a challenge to school segregation. What the Supreme Court said is that if it is unequal, it is unfair. It is inherently unequal. It is a violation of the 14th Amendment of the Bill of Rights of the US Constitution. What the Supreme Court did not say is that you're still guaranteed to that right to an education. They simply said that if the state is going to provide one, they have to apply it equally. Brown versus Board of Education. The state of Michigan actually got us closer to the possibility of a constitutional right to an education in 2016 when 7 Detroit students sued 5 different Detroit schools. Sadly, they sued the state of Michigan because the conditions were so poor in the schools that they argued that their constitutional rights had been infringed upon. The schools and the facilities at the schools were argued to be worse than the facilities argued for in 1954 in Brown versus Board of Education. And I'm talking about 2016, when those students sued the state of Michigan. The case made its way to federal court. So federal court, the Sixth Circuit, which covers Michigan, Tennessee, a few other states in this area, the federal court, a 3-judge panel said, you know what? There is a constitutional right to literacy. Do you know those children could not read and they were graduating with a high school diploma? Do you know those kids would sit in over 100-degree heat in the summer with no AC? They would sit in 20 and 30-degree weather classrooms with no heat. Do you know most of those schools could not pass the safety standards, the health and safety codes in the state of Michigan and within the area of Detroit? In 2016. So 2020, that 3-judge panel of the Sixth Circuit. Now think about it, guys. Federal court, the circuits are 16 judges. So typically when the case makes its way to the federal court, they typically are heard by a panel of the 16 judges. Well, the panel said, a 2-to-1 vote, that in fact there is a constitutional right to literacy, which would translate to a constitutional right to an education. The state of Michigan, a month later, settled the case. They paid the plaintiffs, and they established some guidelines that the state of Michigan would follow, in particular, guidelines that applied to the Detroit schools, including millions and millions of dollars. Now, while that sounds great, and I am happy for Detroit and the state of Michigan, that was the one shot we had in 2020 for that case to make it through the federal court system and possibly heard by the US Supreme Court. Once that case settled, so did the hope at that time that we would have a constitutional right to an education. And you might be saying, well, why do we need a constitutional right to an education? Because that guarantees that children are protected regardless of their race, ethnicity, their socioeconomic class. A constitutional right carries weight. Ironically, the 30 countries that lead the US when it comes to mathematics scores and the like and science scores actually all have a constitutional right to an education in their constitution. We do not in the US. Did you know the United Nations passed a treaty that said, hey, countries, you should guarantee your students a constitutional right to an education? We were the only country that did not sign on to that treaty. Policy matters. Revisiting the 10th Amendment and the fact that the states regulate education, what happens when the state decides that certain children are more important than others? What happens when children get left behind? That's why policy matters. That's why we have to have this conversation. Policy, policy, policy. Because when we fail, then we have a claim. We can file in federal court. We can argue for our constitutional rights. So while Brown versus Board of Education was the start, Gary B., the case in Michigan, was thought to be a case that was going to be even more important than Brown versus Board of Education had that case continued, right out of the great state of Michigan. Policy matters. So that's one thing I want to talk about in terms of policy and education. Now that's that's more of a macro, but the other thing I want to talk to the teachers in the room and the parents in the room, right? Which means everybody sitting in this room, because we're all teachers in a way, right? We all teach. So thinking about another macro issue, or this is more of a micro, the classroom. One of the things that my research discovered, I really wanted to look at sort of this disparity in discipline, right? I wanted to understand the big black boy concept. A Harvard researcher found there was one correlation to disproportionate punishment of children in public schools, and it was summed up in 3 words: big black boy. These children were being suspended as young as 3 years old in preschool, right? So talking about and trying to figure out why that existed was important to me, because I am a human being, I am a parent, right? I am a mother, I am a daughter, right? And I represent this human race. So I just could not understand, how is it that children were how is it that a 3-year-old, right? What could a 3-year-old possibly do? What would prompt a police officer to show up to an Orlando elementary school and put handcuffs on a 6-year-old for a temper tantrum? I wanted to know more. So a lot of my research led me to, and thankfully, I always mention my husband because he's sort of my source of information, right? But I wanted to know more, and my other friends that are teachers, I wanted to know more. You know what I discovered? Bias. The bias that is inherent in all of us. It was bias, right? It was bias that was leading to teachers describing Black children behavior as destructive, dangerous. And then in the same referrals for white children for the same behavior, Johnny's having a bad day. Johnny's behavior needs to be redirected. So how can the same behavior be described so differently when we look at those referrals? Violent, destructive, failure to grow and thrive. Same behavior, Johnny's having a bad day. Redirection. That is bias, ladies and gentlemen. And sometimes it is subconscious. So I'm saying that to say we need to check our own biases. While some will argue we're born with them, I want you to ask yourself, how do they manifest in the decisions you make and how you treat people and how you view the people around you? The last point I'll make is the article I finished 1.5 years ago. It was one of the most difficult pieces to write. And this is a law review article, so not a typical newspaper article, but a law review. And these can range from 60 to 70 pages. They're mini books, right? And as I was writing that article, I was talking about what happens when teachers are consumed by bias. I said, what happens, but they're human beings, right? So what happens, one of my taglines in the article was, what happens when George Zimmerman gets up in the morning and he goes to work? If you don't know, George Zimmerman is the man who killed Trayvon Martin, a kid that was walking in a legal place that he had a right to be in a Central Florida neighborhood that really, some would argue, was the impetus for the modern day movement. It was the death of Trayvon Martin. So as I was writing that article, as I closed, I was having a hard time. I could barely get through the pages because it also was the 10-year anniversary of Trayvon Martin's death. He died so senselessly. And I called my father and I said, I'm just struggling with this. And this is a man who has no college degree, right? Who has no higher education, but has life education. And he said these words to me. He said, you cry about it, but you keep writing. People need to know. So I challenge you to keep working and keep fighting, because the words of my father were correct. We have to keep fighting for equality for all children. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Jackson. I'd like to invite other panelists to comment.
I'd like to attack that question from a micro perspective. Policy drives accountability frameworks in public education. Accountability framework drives educators and administrators' behaviors. Behaviors drive student outcomes. Policy, and from my perspective as a teacher, oftentimes put a higher priority on outcomes of standardized tests than on authentic learning. And what does that look like in a classroom? As a mathematics teacher, I look at things from the standpoint of I want students to be able to develop a conceptual understanding, leverage that conceptual understanding to help them be able to develop procedural fluency, and in the course of doing that, be able to apply those concepts in a way that's meaningful in a context different from a math classroom. So when we start talking about developing a conceptual understanding, that is something that is not typical in most math classrooms in the United States. In math classes, very typically, it's a sit and get approach. We emphasize fluency. Do you know how to use the quadratic equation? Not do you understand what the quadratic equation is, but when prompted, can you regurgitate that formula? Can you follow these steps to get to this end? And that is a deficient model for education, specifically in a math classroom, but that's what we're confronted with because policy demands that we're evaluated, that our schools value, that our students value is based on performance on standardized tests. Without getting too deep into standardized tests, we know its foundation is in a white supremacy ideology. And the fact that we use that to measure students of color and to determine whether or not there is an, forgive me for saying this expression, achievement gap. I denounce that terminology. It is not an achievement gap. It is a system built on white supremacy and ideology, using a tool built on white supremacy and ideology, giving us a result that says students are deficient. Students that are oppressed are the problem if we use that terminology, and I denounce that. So with that being said, policy drives behaviors in the classroom. Teachers feel the pressure to have their students be successful and do it in a certain period of time, independent of an authentic and engaging learning experience. So teachers, under that pressure, oftentimes cut corners. And who suffers? Students. But more specifically, if we look at all the different issues that exist in education, time and time again, and thank you, COVID, for help bearing this out, students of colors are the ones that are most impacted by those issues, by those problems. COVID's impact on students of color was very significant, and it continues, and it's part of the issues that schools, school boards face now is the impact of COVID, and how do we help bring students through this toxic experience and keep them centered on learning? Well, one thing that happens, attendance. There's an attendance issue now. Students' attendance has gone down since COVID. The pressure for teachers to be successful at getting their students to perform on these standardized tests has not changed. So now we're expecting outcomes with less instructional time driven by policy. So policy is very important from a classroom perspective. We have an obligation to focus not on standardized test scores. We have an obligation to focus on an authentic learning experience for students. And that's what needs to drive our work. Thank you.
And thank you for those who've already submitted your questions. I appreciate it. For the next question, I'd like to direct this to begin with, Professor McLemore. What strategies, techniques, or advancements do you believe provide avenues for equitable education?
Yeah, so I think both Alicia and Michael kind of touched on some of the discrepancies that I think we can build on. So, I think at an individual level, conversations we've been having at the higher ed level for several years now about really taking a critical eye towards the curriculum, our lesson planning, even more innocuous things like when do we set deadlines for assignments? So I think part of it requires taking a really critical eye towards improving equity by taking a really hard look at our curriculum, decolonizing our lesson planning, to appreciate the diversity of the students and the lived experiences of the students in our classroom, and recognizing that reducing inequality is not a zero-sum game, that all students benefit when we dismantle systemic racism. So I think that's some things that we can do. I think this is obviously a really big question. One thing I was thinking about more from a systems level is when Congress puts forth policies or proposals for spending cuts or new policies, the Congressional Budget Office will score them and will do an estimation of how much that's going to cost, and they have different assumptions about that. But something I think we need to do more of is doing more of an equity assessment of how are these policies actually going to impact equity, and thinking through ahead of time, how some of these more colorblind policies actually have really disparate impacts. That's something I do a lot on the back end of looking at how the implementation of certain policies have disparate impacts. But I think doing more on the front end to kind of anticipate what some of these inequities, obviously we can't anticipate all of them, but doing more work, I think, on the front end to try to understand where these gaps might emerge, to try to promote more, to design more policies that are more equitable is a starting point, I would say.
I'd like to invite anybody else who'd like to add additional comments.
We have to invest more in education, period. We spend more money on prisons than we do on education. That is problematic. Investing in education happens in multiple ways. Funding, certainly. We have to acknowledge systemic and structural racism. We have to acknowledge redlining that kept Black people and minorities living in certain neighborhoods, so the tax base is different. All those things are true. But also investing in investing in education means investing in teachers, teacher training, being very honest about what it means to teach, but also holding teachers in the same regard we hold other professions, right? We talk about lawyers and doctors and, all these things. When are we gonna start talking about teachers in that way? And the reason why that is so incredibly important is because no matter who you become in this world, you had a teacher. That's a certain level of investment that we have to do. In writing that article, I had to constantly say, I am not, by no means am I saying that teachers are racist or that teachers are, no. But the fact of the matter is that as human beings, we do have biases and we have all those things. But what about training teachers and having these conversations? Why not have those conversations? Right? So I think investing in education is a strategy that we control that as taxpayers. We're the ones voting in. It's not just about the big election. What about your midterm elections? What about your governor that appoints your Secretary of Education in the state that makes the decisions? So we do have a voice in that conversation. So definitely investing more in education. Why not make education a priority on your list when you're looking at politicians? How do they feel about education? What have they said about it? And remember, not just what they're saying to you today. Do a quick Google search to see what they said about it 5 years ago. Right? The internet is a powerful tool. Let me say it again. The internet is a powerful tool. I'm curious about your tweets, right? But definitely investing in education and making that a priority for us as ordinary human beings caring about funding education is a strategy. And that is one of the quickest way to make it most equitable.
Thank you. I'd like to insert some of these audience questions. Going back to thinking about funding education, and we've talked a little bit about how it's currently funded and the problems with that. We have two questions that are about what are other viable options to fund public school education, and can we look to other countries that may offer some advice or some solutions? I open this up to anybody who would like to take this question.
It goes to accountability and what Alicia said with regards to being the taxpayer. We control what happens in terms of how our money is spent. We've known for decades that using Property taxes to fund education is not an effective way to fund education equitably. So we have to demand changes. We have to hold legislators accountable. We have to hold policy accountable. One thing that I think is prevalent in education, especially on the K-12 level, is this surface level approach at dealing with issues, talking about them for a short time period, enough to get the votes needed to return to office, and then never following through or digging deeper. A lot of the issues that are embedded in education are at a deep level. You cannot address these issues just by a surface level. As a parent, I have 4 children. My children have been fairly successful in education to this point. One, God forgive me, is an actual University of Michigan alum, and my other is a Purdue alum. So those conversations are fun, but I didn't have the awareness and understanding of the issues and challenges in education until I became an educator. So it is very important that we get the message out, that we communicate those issues, that we make people aware of them, that we have those conversations that sometimes make people a bit uncomfortable because they don't want to know that that wonderful school their student attends has some racism issues. One thing that I learned is that oftentimes the way students are assigned to classes is rooted in racism. Myself, as an example, when I was in junior high school, my teacher recommended that I move on to honors algebra as a freshman. My white counterparts were recommended to move on to an AP track. When I was sitting down with my counterparts, helping them with their AP homework, I realized that I was probably on the wrong track and moved over to the AP track. So those types of things happen daily in education, and all too often we're not aware of it as parents because, hey, Johnny got an A, and we're satisfied. We can't be satisfied with grades, which is a misrepresentation of learning anyway. But we have to dig deep. We have to hold people accountable for telling the story and telling it at a level deeper than just what's on the surface. And that's where you're going to be exposed to some of those ugly truths about education.
Thank you. You know, I'd like to continue this conversation about strategies and techniques and advancements. Many of us in the educational system and those who have worked towards it have seen the increase of charter schools. Can we talk a little bit about what charter schools means in terms of providing access or not providing access, and particularly in under-resourced, people of color-focused communities?
I think it depends a lot on the state that you live in. Certainly in some states, they have touted success with charter schools, alternatives to traditional curriculums, right? Focusing on things like STEM, right? There's the STEM charter school, so not all charter schools are bad or evil, right? I think you always have to follow the money trail. Right. So when I say follow the money trail, what do I really mean by that? Well, I mean looking at things like vouchers concern me more than just charter schools. So when the state decides we're going to grant vouchers, which is public funds to private schools, some of which are religious private schools, and take money out of the public schools, I want to know more. That makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up, right? I want to know why we would take public funds and use public funds to fund private schools that taxpayers cannot afford typically to attend. That concerns me, right? So always follow the money trail, even when you're looking at these charter schools, because some states also will tell you charter schools have very strenuous rules. So they're positives, right? Where they have to follow school board rules or Department of Education rules in that particular state. The downside might be some charter schools don't require certain degree levels, right? So it all depends on the state, but I always say follow the money trail. And thinking about sort of the money trail, another thing to think about. I was so curious about sort of this whole conversation around the African American Studies AP class. I thought about it when Michael mentioned AP classes and why the state of Florida was pushing against these AP classes. So with some quick digging, I soon discovered that recently the board, the state of Florida asked the College Board, who creates the AP courses, to reconstruct its psychology course because there was concern about the sexual orientation unit and inside of the psychology AP course. So Florida asked that the College Board restructure that course. The College Board said no, finally. Interestingly enough, they had just said yes about restructuring the African American Studies course, right? There's something called a slippery slope. Just because it doesn't impact you today, I promise you it comes back around and will affect you tomorrow. That AP course in African American Studies was reconfigured. AP courses are created by teachers and college professors. They are designed to prepare students for what they will experience on the collegiate level. That's what an AP course does. So for a state to say, we have a problem with that course, we think that course does indoctrination, right? That's why we don't like that African American Studies AP course. And for the College Board to change the course because of that. So here's the point about the money trail. I said, but why? Why would the College Board yield? Quick fact, Florida is the second state or second largest state to administer AP courses, only behind Connecticut. What does that mean? Follow the money trail. We were administering the majority of AP courses in the country. So when Florida said we don't like it, the board bend. The board decided to bend. But finally they stood up and said no to the psychology AP course. So always follow the money trail. It's your money. And don't be afraid to ask where it's going. So whether it's charter schools, voucher programs, follow the money.
Touch on that. To touch on that AP piece and follow the money, in my state, Illinois, where students take the AP classes, they're required to take the AP exam, and there's a fee for sitting to take that exam. If you're taking 3 or 4 AP courses, you must pay that fee for each of those courses individually. So as she stated, follow the money.
There were quite a few questions about standardized exams, both at the K through 12 in terms of assessment and evaluation, but also entry into higher education. Can we talk a little bit about how standardized exams impact inequality in education?
Yes, gladly. Standardized exams, it's confusing from the standpoint that we have this fascination, this tie to standardized tests, and you would be hard pressed to find research that supports standardized testing as an effective measure of students' ability to be successful in college, which is pretty much what they're intended to do. And that has gone on for years and years and years. Fortunately, at this point, again, somewhat with the onset of COVID, universities have started to take a different look at the significance of standardized testings in terms of their admission policies. During COVID, a number of schools waived that as a requirement for admission, and you can find students who probably wouldn't have done so well on standardized tests thriving in some of those universities. So it's never been this incredible tool or resource the way it's portrayed. It's always has issues. It's been known from the start that they were designed, again, based on a white supremacy ideology. And so our country's fascination for me is somewhat puzzling until I consider the motivation. So standardized tests, again, have never been this gold standard for measuring learning or measuring education. And real quickly, oftentimes it doesn't even reflect the curriculum.
I want to pick up on that point. So I think, and I feel like we're at like a catch-22. So I'm curious to hear what you all think about this. But I think the flip side of that argument is people will say, well, getting rid of standardized tests for admission to higher ed means that schools' admissions teams have to rely on other factors like high school grades and extracurricular activities and all these other factors, which themselves, I think, have similar concerns about, the racism underlying differences in GPA and things like that. So I'm curious, I don't know what the right answer is, but I'd be curious to hear what you all think about that. I mean, I would be curious also to see, did removing standardized tests, did that result in getting a more diverse set of students going to higher ed? I don't know the answer to that yet.
Not that I have the answers, but there's some things that I am aware of with regards to standardized tests. One of my students was very focused on getting into a particular school. And I mean, she was very emotionally tethered to being admitted. And I cautioned her about that. I said, one thing you need to understand is that there are tons of highly selective schools that reject students with 4.0 and higher GPAs that score 14, 1500 on the SAT. So if standardized tests is such as gold standard, why does that happen? But it happens over and over and over again. What they do is they look at students holistically. They look at their story. They look at their level of engagement in community service in their community. Do they have evidence to support their claims about who they are as a person and what value they'll bring to the university? So schools do it on a regular basis, especially your highly selective schools. They make decisions independent of those test scores because that's just the entry point for the application. So it's not this magic wand. It has issues, and again, universities do it on a regular basis, make decisions based on factors other than standardized test scores.
You. I'd like to continue with the question we had, introductory questions about what strides do you believe we've made towards addressing educational racism, and where do you believe more work is needed?
I certainly think we've made strides, sort of going back to this conversation around discipline disparities. I think there have been strides made. For example, as a part of the Department of Education, there is the Office of Civil Rights, and their job is to enforce the Civil Rights Act. So under the Obama administration, they started sending letters to states saying, your district is out of compliance. This district within your state is out of compliance. They're out of compliance. They're running afoul of federal civil law by disciplining students in the way that they are. Your numbers are off the chart. They do not sustain. We reviewed your records. And by the way, the only reason the government knows about these discipline disparities is following the money. So in order for schools to get funding from the federal government, they must complete an annual report that explains or details how many students have been suspended, the race of those students, the gender of those students. They have to detail that information. So in reviewing that information, the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights started sending out these letters saying, you are running afoul. You need to answer to us right away. So a byproduct of that was that that particular office started giving, or they do it from the president's office, they started sending discipline guidance. So they gave instruction, guidance, technical support, training to teachers about how to discipline students and who should be disciplined and things of that nature. So really interesting guidance that was sent from the federal government. So I would call that a stride, right? So unfortunately, that was a directive from the president's office. So after President Obama left office and President Trump came to office, then his Secretary of Education decided to rescind those guidance letters. So states who were on notice were then no longer required to apply the guidance that was set forth by the president's office. So when you think about education too, in that regard, I think you have to think about how education can be politicized. It's political. We didn't think that until probably 15 years ago, maybe less, right? Who thought of education being political? Well, it is. It is absolutely political. And so we want to be aware of things of that nature. So strides, but also challenges in education. So something to think about, but certainly the awareness, the level of awareness of the American public is critical in terms of making strides. So I think coming from that perspective of what strides we've made, there have been some, certainly, but I also think we are now dealing with another set of challenges. We're also dealing with challenges where states are banning books, right? Kudos to the state of Illinois, where the governor just signed into law a requirement that books cannot be banned in the state of Illinois, right? That is a stride. That is the first state in the nation to do so. That's a stride. Another kudos to the state of Michigan, where your governor just signed the Crown Act. So you might be thinking, well, what does that have to do with schools? Let me tell you a secret. It has a lot to do with schools. Do you know that one of the main reasons students of color are disproportionately punished, disciplined, and expelled is their hair? Their hair. So the Crown Act will prevent a lot of that from happening in the state of Michigan. So some successes, some strides, but also some challenges.
Quick response to that. Yes, there have been strides. My standard for measuring how significant those strides are was impacted by a presentation I attended by Dr. Danny Martin at NCTM conference in 2018. Dr. Martin challenged a group of teachers with the question, are we worthy of the brilliance of Black children? That's what my reaction was. I was just stopped for a moment and said, let me ponder that. Are we worthy of the brilliance of Black children? And since that time, for me, I've translated that to mean, are we giving them the best opportunities to be successful in our educational system, not for our purposes, but for theirs and their community and their choices? So have we made strides? Yes. But as a teacher, I'm a firm believer in fun, which is the fierce urgency of now. All too often, if I'm being told to be patient, it's not for the right reason. We have to be responsive to the needs of Black children, and we have to do it now.
Thank you. As we talk about strides and advancement, we've gotten several questions about AI and how artificial or generative artificial intelligent technologies are changing the educational landscape.
I oftentimes tell my students that it's not the tool, but how we use the tool where the challenge lies. We all need water to live, but certainly we all have heard too many stories of people drowning. For a long time in math, they have these little apps on your phone where you can scan a math problem and it can spit out the answer right away for you. And my students always ask me, Mr. Rouse, how do you feel about that? I said, I love it if you use it properly. If you use it as a way to verify whether or not the work you did was correct and then go back and analyze your own work to see what mistake you may have made, then that's a wonderful use. But if you're doing that simply to complete homework, where if you turn it in and you have something on the paper, you get full credit for it, that undermines the educational experience. So with AI, I say that is very much the same scenario. It's not the problem is with AI, it's how we choose to use it in education. Are we using it to enhance the learning experience? Are we using it to substitute for the learning experience? So hopefully I answered that question regarding AI.
Only thing I would add about AI is the awareness that there is racism in AI. There's an entire movement right now that's being studied. A particular researcher at MIT was doing some very basic research, and she realized that as she was a graduate student doing this research, that as she was working with the technology, it would not recognize her Black face. So she decided to put on a white mask, and it recognized her face. Isn't that interesting? So I just want to plant that to be aware, right? That there is racism, even in artificial intelligence, How can that be? When you talk about structural racism, when we talk about the systems of racism baked into our everyday lives, that should be shocking to the core. That even artificial intelligence was found to be, by these researchers, leading technology researchers found that artificial intelligence can be racist. Wow.
I'll just say one follow-up thing on that. I think that's obviously really concerning and we need to be aware of it. But I think on the one silver lining of that is I think I'll be optimistic and say I think it's actually easier to correct an AI than it is to correct in individuals. I think that's one thing. You know, AI is based on feeding it data. So I think having people aware of these things and being able to feed different data to AI at least gives me a little bit of optimism that we can turn AI, like Michael said, into something for good.
Thank you. We do have to come to a wrap up for this session, and so I'm going to ask a few questions. I do want to point that out. Thank you again for your questions from the audience. I'd like to ask each panelist as a final question, in the next minute or so, can you tell us a little bit about what you're most hopeful for as it relates to the future of education?
I want to reframe that question to what I'd like to charge you to do as I do the work, right? Number one, I want to charge you to speak up. I want to charge you to show up, right? That's my charge. Speak up. Martin Luther King said that where there is injustice anywhere, there is injustice everywhere. While it may not impact your child or your neighborhood, it will impact us all. So speak up. Say something. The government that you're disenfranchised with, or the local community or the mayor, they're using your money. So speak up, number one. The second thing I want to charge you to do is to vote. We spent yesterday talking about voter suppression and what that looks like. And I'm in awe when I hear about how intentional voter suppression is, how legislators sit in a room and decide we're going to end Sunday voting. We're going to end early. We're not going to allow people to receive bottled water and food while they wait in line for 6 hours to vote. It took me 6 hours to vote during President Barack Obama's first election with my 2-year-old in a stroller. 6 hours, where my colleagues, when we got back to work the next day, talked about voting in 15 minutes, right? So vote, and don't just vote on the big one. Pay attention to the smaller elections. That's how your governors are voted in. That's how your local officials are voted in, and don't pay attention to what they are telling you today. Remember? Pay attention to what they have said and what they have done. So that's my challenge to you as I challenge myself. It is not easy work. I call it the emotional toll of being a truth teller. When I walk into the classroom, I don't plan to indoctrinate my students. I simply tell them the truth. We review the cases, the facts, the law, and then they're able to make judgments from there, right? So educate yourself, speak up, show up, and vote. That's my challenge to you, or my charge to you as I charge myself.
You know, I would say the thing I'm most hopeful about is that we're engaging in more of these conversations, that we are becoming, I think, more open to making ourselves uncomfortable, having these uncomfortable conversations. So while I think I was saying to Michael beforehand, I think this question is really hard to answer because there's a lot that discourages me every day, and there's a lot that makes me very cynical. So trying to look on the bright side, I think the thing that makes me the most hopeful is that these kinds of conversations are becoming more and more regular, that more and more people are having these types of conversations. And as Alicia said, I think, you know, turning those conversations into action is where I see hope for the future.
When I think of this question, I think of a quote by Lerone Bennett Jr., and I'm going to paraphrase because I don't remember exactly, but he said something to the effect, if you're a part of an educational system that oppresses, you're either an oppressor or a revolutionary. I'm challenging us all to be revolutionaries. Don't accept the status quo. Challenge the status quo. Challenge your teachers about the status quo. Challenge your administrators. Challenge your district leaders. Challenge your legislators. Dig in and find out what's really going on in your students' schools. Work by Zaretta Hammond has taught us that culturally responsive teaching is simply utilizing best instructional practices for all students. So if a teacher is being culturally responsive, everyone benefits. Hold those people accountable for educating our children accountable. Dig in, reject the status quo. And if you dare, be a revolutionary and support those who deal with those challenges and frustrations and sometimes isolation for doing that work.
I'm gonna come up here just to invite you to give me one last round of applause to our panelists. Thank you for sharing your personal, professional, and career experiences, for charging us today with lots to do, for helping us recognize what we're seeing and feeling is valid and true, and that we're not alone in this great fight. We hope that you leave today not only embracing the complicated and complex spaces that we all occupy as students, staff, community members, administrators, learners. We hope you also continue to remain motivated in pushing boundaries and moving forward instead of back. So we're not done today. So as a reminder, we have a virtual session during the lunchtime on tech and empowering our communities with a Caroline performance included. It will begin at 12 noon, which is right around the corner. In order to participate in this virtual event, you have to go onto the Juneteenth website and click there for that Zoom link. We hope to see you there. Otherwise, we hope you continue celebrating Juneteenth by sharing the information you've gained over the past 2 days with others. Thank you.
We'll also be back here at 1 p.m. for our closing keynote session. So please come back to this space and join us then. Thank you.
Good.